Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Often when we discuss national security, we tend to focus on quote-unquote hard security concepts, things like military capability, nuclear weapons, deterrence, and other things that are comfortable to those who have studied security for a long time. But if we think about the concept of national security, it is itself somewhat contingent. What does it mean to be secure? Are we secure from something or someone? And who is it that we mean by the concept of nation? Frequent listeners to Horns will have heard in our discussion with Kori Schake, Derek Chollet, and Jim Goldgeier the notion that the concurrent pandemic and crisis of racial justice requires us to reconceptualize what we mean by national security. Today, we're joined by a guest, Professor Shirin Sinnar of Stanford University Law School, who's going to help us do just that. Professor Sinnar teaches a course on race, identity, and national security at the law school, and we're really privileged to have her with us to discuss this important topic. Professor Sinnar, I'll turn it over to you for a brief introduction.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting this conversation. So I teach at Stanford Law School. I've taught there for most of the last decade, and I focus on civil rights, national security, civil rights litigation, and related topics. I began my career as a civil rights lawyer, working on issues of discrimination and immigrants' rights, as well as national security-related profiling.
Excellent. So perhaps the most logical place to start is to ask, why would we talk about race and national security? These are topics where, as I mentioned, sort of the mainstream traditional national security discussion doesn't find a lot of overlap, and yet there seems to be.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we typically think of these as largely different concepts, that race is something that's an important issue, but largely for our domestic context. And national security, we frequently think of in terms of defense or responses to foreign threats. And I think in most conversations, if we acknowledge that there may be an intersection, we tend to think, well, maybe it's limited to some very particular set of issues where there's a relationship. But other than that, these are different. And from my perspective, they're much more fundamentally related in that race shapes national security and national security shapes race. So as academics sometimes say, these are concepts that are mutually constitutive, and getting at those connections, those deeper relationships is really important to understanding the experience of people who are affected by national security policies and may sometimes be left out of our typical conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that, national security, the phrase itself, contains two concepts that are mutually constitutive, right? Because, I mean, the whole idea of a nation consists of an idea that you have some sort of common identity. And when you and I were discussing before the podcast, I raised the work of Benedict Anderson with Imagined Communities, and this idea that for so many of us, while we would identify as an American, that beyond that, there's not really a whole lot that ties us all together. And I'm curious about the role that race plays in defining our national identity.
Yeah, well, I think when we look historically at how the nation has been conceived, often what we've talked about is actually a white nation rather than a multiracial, multicultural nation. And you see that even in Supreme Court opinions where the court, in talking about threats to security, is explicitly referring to the nation being threatened by the mere presence of people, of foreigners of different races. And, that language is so explicit in the way that courts have often described what our nation is and what it means to face threats to our security from those who are not like us, and us meaning the white nation that the country was originally seen as being. I think maybe just another more colloquial way of thinking about this is, when I teach the course in race, identity, and national security at Stanford, I've had some students, usually African American, who have said, well, I don't feel afraid of an ISIS terrorist. What I'm afraid of is my own government. And when we talk about national security, the security threats that I feel most viscerally are from the state. They're not from private individuals or foreign countries or anything like that. So just at a very personal level, people's experience of national security is very different depending on what part of the nation they may see themselves as part of.
And that raises, the other half of this is the question of security as this, again, very contingent and mutually constitutive concept. Ironically, when we changed the name of the Department of War to the Department of Defense, we seemed to go from a construct that was focused on fighting battles to defend the United States to a construct that at the very least is focused on defending forward. And yet the idea that threats to our security and our well-being for some substantial portion of our population may come from within is something that I think is very problematic and very problematic to our self-conception of who we are.
I think that's right. And it's not just that threats to our security may come from within as opposed to without. So, that is one boundary one might consider, but it's also about whether you think of the state as a protector of your security or as the source of your insecurity. So I think it's not just that when we talk about national security, we're historically have thought about the nation in limited ways, in racially contingent ways, but we've also thought about national security as being something that the state protects. So the state is your ally. The set of institutions created to protect security are on your side if you are a member of that nation. But that is not the experience of many people for whom the state is actually the source of some of their greatest insecurities.
So certainly since World War II, the notion of providing for national security has consumed a historically unique proportion of U.S. resources, of attention, and of our role on the world stage. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we came to be this national security state, how national security as we understand it in a modern sense came to be such an important part of who we are and how we operate in the world.
I think many historians would describe the onset of national security as an idea and a common phrase in our discourse. They would date that back to the period immediately before, during, and after World War II. And, it was a time when political scientists like Pendleton Herring at Harvard and others were popularizing this phrase national security. And the creation of the National Security Act, the adoption of that act in 1947, which marked the onset of many of our current national security institutions. So, it created the CIA, the structure of peacetime intelligence collection that we now have, the National Security Council, the institutions that became the Defense Department. That is often dated to the 1947 National Security Act. But what's important in thinking about that time period is that it's not just that we created these institutions, but that they were created with a particular set of beliefs. And those beliefs included the idea that the U.S. was fundamentally vulnerable, that particularly after Pearl Harbor, the sense that we were separated by oceans was no longer as prominent. The fear of totalitarian regimes abroad led to this new sense that the U.S. was at risk and that we needed a permanent infrastructure for national security to address that risk. And wrapped up in that idea was the idea that we might need to deviate from the rule of law or civil liberties if it meant protecting our national security. So I think when I think about that time period and the formation or origins of this idea of national security, what's important to think through is that national security was never just a descriptive label pertaining to policies around national defense, but it was a particular idea that called on the urgency of national survival and was willing to deviate from law and liberties to protect what was thought of as national security.
And as you mentioned, the role of World War II and this changing conception of the U.S. role in the world, I think this also marked, at least in the modern sense, a change in how the U.S. defense establishment dealt with questions of race. That if you take a look at the Tuskegee Airmen, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, other instances where groups who had previously been excluded from the discussion were included in segregated units and distinguished themselves extraordinarily. And my sense is that history was very powerful in moving forward the move to initiate the integration of the armed forces in 1948. Is that an accurate sense of that history?
My sense of that history is that it's accurate, but only reflects a piece of the picture. And Here, when I think about this time period and the impact both of the service of African Americans in World War II and the subsequent several decades during the Cold War, you had a couple of things going on kind of at the intersection of race or civil rights in particular and national security. So the rosier story is that national security imperatives led to the advancement of African American civil rights. And this account is often associated with historians like Mary Dudziak, who in this book, Cold War Civil Rights, documented how appeals to Cold War needs and the need in particular to defeat Soviet rhetoric around racial injustice in the U.S. pushed forward African American civil rights. So you had that happening where African American civil rights were being advanced both by the idea that people had served in World War II and deserved recognition and equality, but also the sense that in response to Soviet rhetoric about the persistence of racial injustice and the need to win hearts and minds across the third world, you needed to protect African American civil rights more than they had been in the past. I said that's a rosier story. In some sense, it's not, because it challenges the traditional account of civil rights as moving forward, mostly as a moral victory, of people coming to realize the importance of of equality and integration and all of that. So it's less rosy than that story in suggesting that a pragmatic need to meet national security needs was part of the reason that civil rights moved forward in that time. Why I say that it's still a rosier account is that during this very same time period, we also see government institutions, national security institutions, suppressing domestic civil rights activism, particularly when it came from African Americans who went beyond calling for formal racial equality or desegregation and asked for other types of changes to the racial and social economic order. So if they were asking for, to change the social and economic order in a way that countered poverty, for instance, if they were linking the U.S. civil rights struggle to anti-imperial or anti-colonial struggles abroad, if they were talking about the Vietnam War and resistance to the war, like once they began pitching their demands for equality in terms other than just formal legal rights, that met with extraordinary backlash from national security institutions, including but not limited to the FBI. So in thinking about this time period, I see there being a couple of stories where African American civil rights, at least in terms of formal equality, was being advanced by pointing to national security needs and logic, yet that same set of national security rhetoric and needs were being used simultaneously to suppress domestic political activism.
Yeah, the Dudziak book on civil rights and during the Cold War is on your syllabus, and I was able to skim some of it in preparation, and it kind of actually turned a light bulb on my head that should have gone on before, because, I was aware on the one hand of the role of people like Paul Robeson and others in working for civil rights, and I was also aware of their targeting by groups like the House Un-American Affairs Committee. And it never really occurred to me until looking at the degree to which the actions were motivated in part by a desire to forestall communist propaganda, that this was part of why the FBI maintained this notion of civil rights as a communist movement and these sorts of things, that it made that connection easy for them to make and thus easy to label civil rights activists with that charge.
That's right. And I think that happened all through this time period. And it was a really difficult challenge for civil rights activists to present themselves in a way that did not make them susceptible to that charge. But the more, as I noted, there was a wide difference in talking about desegregation, for instance, and then moving from that to talking about addressing social inequality. Because once you started talking about that, you became susceptible to a charge that, well, what you're actually talking about is, a communist, re-envisioning of society. And that very quickly brought people under the suspicion of the FBI and other institutions.
Right. And I think that same distinction between segregation as a policy of government and social justice as a policy of practice was also reflected in the differential response, for instance, to the death penalty cases that disproportionately penalized Black Americans with the death penalty, especially if they were found guilty of killing white Americans, versus the response to lynchings. And one of the other things that I found interesting in a very troubling way in Dudziak's book was the degree to which lynching was opposed more by the State Department at times than the Justice Department, it seemed. Is that accurate, do you think?
I'm not sure specifically about the State Department versus the Justice Department's positions on the issue, but certainly the State Department and institutions that were outwardly focused were very aware of the extent to which every time there was a lynching that made national and international headlines, it affected U.S. foreign policy. It affected the attempt of the U.S. to show itself as a supporter of democracy and equal rights around the world. So there was very much a sense that lynchings were a threat to the U.S. image abroad, and groups that were outwardly focused were aware of that. Within the U.S. Government, other units of the government, for some, there was a sense that, or the argument was often made in terms of federalism, that we as a federal government ought not get involved with what is essentially a local issue or an issue that state and local law enforcement should consider, but not us. Despite the fact that in many cases the real issue was that state and local law enforcement were completely complicit with lynchings and mob violence against African Americans. So in that context, turning aside federal jurisdiction or federal interest and prioritization of the problem essentially meant giving full power to local law enforcement officials, which were involved with lynchings.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of another element that, and I'm grateful to Professor Lindsay Kahn of the Naval War College, who was the first one who really educated me on this, is many people tend to think of the Posse Comitatus Act as a bulwark against the use of the military domestically and as a feature, as it were, of U.S. civil-military relations. But when you actually dig through that history, it's a very similar troubled sort of story where it was intended to prevent the use of federal troops to interfere with local governments and local officials who were not protecting the rights of Black Americans in the wake of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so, yeah, it's that tension between state and local has been a challenge as long as we have dealt with this within our system. But national security broadly is an area where the government gets a great deal of leeway. I'm curious if you can talk about how the government has used this leeway legally in terms of things that they have done in the name of national security that impinge on questions of race.
Yeah. Well, here, unfortunately, we've had a fairly long and sordid history, but I think to take maybe the two most prominent examples of this, I would turn to the Korematsu case from the 1940s and in much more recent history, the travel ban. So these are both examples of cases where people brought constitutional challenges to policies of exclusion on racial or religious grounds. And in each case, the Supreme Court took the position that it ought to have a lot of deference to the policies of the executive branch and the political branches. And this idea that that courts ought to defer to executive actors when it comes to national security has often been bound up with considerations of race. And I can talk more about that history in the very idea of national security deference if you'd like. But these were both decisions where the court had fairly open evidence indicating that racial or religious bias was a motivation behind the policies. So sometimes it's said of the internment, well, afterwards, long after it happened, we, historians have disclosed evidence that actually the Justice Department knew that Japanese Americans were not a threat, but it suppressed that evidence before the Supreme Court. And that's true. And in fact, it led the acting Solicitor General a few years ago to publicly apologize for hiding some of that evidence in the court case Korematsu. But more fundamentally, even at the time, it was known that the reports of the military commander who had ordered Japanese American internment spoke of Japanese Americans as an enemy race, as a population that was subversive, that was prone to emperor worship and could not be trusted. So that kind of rhetoric was open on the face of it. And yet the Supreme Court essentially said, well, we can't judge. We cannot look at the reasons behind the internment or the curfew orders. That's not our role. And what's so disturbing is that 2 years ago, the Supreme Court essentially adopted that very same idea in responding to the travel ban case. And unlike most cases in which race is implicated in national security, again, you had fairly open evidence of, not just fairly, extremely open evidence of bigoted language on the part of the president, both before and after his election as president. And yet the court said essentially, well, if we can postulate any security reason for the travel ban policy, then we don't need to consider the litany of statements suggesting religious animus. So in both of these cases, it's the court essentially saying that we will defer to executive policy when national security is asserted, whether or not there's either a strong national security logic for what the court is doing, or on the other hand, open evidence of animus.
Yeah, and I was really fascinated by Deborah Pearlstein's recent article in which she pointed out that Korematsu, for example, has never been overruled, and yet it has become part of what she called the anti-canon in terms of sorts of cases that are universally, well, near universally regarded as examples of what not to do.
Right. And I think the court even recognized that. So in its decision on the travel ban, it explicitly disavows Korematsu to say that what we're doing here is not reliving Korematsu. That's not what we're doing. In fact, we don't think Korematsu was rightly decided. They actually say that in the travel ban decision. But the deep irony of that is that the problem with Korematsu in terms of deferring to the court, deferring to the government, despite open evidence of animus towards a group, that problem was exactly the problem behind the travel ban opinion. So it's not enough to formally disavow an opinion if the same mistake is being repeated.
Yeah, and this issue of deference and presumption of regularity to a facially valid reason, even if it contradicts what's going on, that also raised its head in the census case last term, correct?
It did, but in the census case, the court was actually, well, at least a majority of the court, with a dissent, but was willing to recognize that the process that had led to the adoption of a citizenship question in the census, was problematic. And there they were willing to consider that the reason that was given for including the citizenship question did not appear to be the real reason that the Census Department adopted that question. So there you have a slight difference in that the court was willing to actually look at that evidence and take it into account. And I think that actually contrasts with the travel ban case, where it put aside the evidence suggesting bias and accepted the government's explanation of the travel ban policy.
Up to this point, we've been talking in large degree about the government's relation with Americans whose race has, to a greater or lesser extent, often led them to feel excluded from the definition of the nation and the definition of those who are included in security. Another challenge that's raised its head more recently has been the rise of white supremacist and white nationalist groups who sometimes seek to appropriate the concept of America and to use some of the same language in order to justify a vision that's very different in terms of those for whom the rights of Americans are reserved and the liberties and protections that are afforded to them. There's been discussion of whether we need, in order to combat groups like this, a law on domestic terrorism. I'm curious your thoughts on this.
So I think the conversation we're having about white nationalist violence is really important. It ought to be one that we have had for a much longer period of time. And so the priority in that the issue has received in recent years among law enforcement is important. Nonetheless, the specific move to apply terrorism and national security legal frameworks to the problem of white supremacist violence is one that I'm really concerned about. And so you do have now some former national security officials, calling for this federal domestic terrorism charge. And I think they see it as something that's inclusive, that will say, well, we see the problem of white nationalist violence as enough of a threat that we want to bring these powerful mechanisms to respond to it. But if you look at our larger history of race and national security and how we have tended to view threats to security in the past, that doesn't leave much comfort that any expansion of terrorism frameworks domestically will only end up affecting indigenous activists challenging oil pipelines, or Black activists as part of the movement for Black Lives, or others on the left who will be designated or seen in terms of a threat of terrorism. So that's part of my concern with adopting new federal terrorism laws, or even more generally, unleashing joint terrorism task forces and other institutional mechanisms against a wider set of groups domestically. A lot of those charges, surveillance practices, institutions have already been deployed for the last 20 years against Muslim American communities in ways that are quite concerning. And any expansion, even if it is in the name of tackling white supremacy, I fear will end up affecting more people of color and those who are seen as a threat to our existing racial or social order. And just to give one example of that, just a couple of years ago, 80 members of Congress signed a letter to Attorney General Sessions, calling for the use of domestic terrorism prosecutions against people who are disrupting oil pipelines. And, you think about this, there's 80 members of Congress, and many of them were actually people who were getting money from the oil and gas industry. Some of these members who were signatories to this letter ended up sponsoring domestic terrorism legislation in Congress to create new federal terrorism charges. So, from a structural, it's not that you have to believe that people within national security institutions are pervasively white supremacists or anything like that. It's not, but even kind of the structure of who has power and the power to influence the way that these policies and charges and institutions are deployed, relates to broader structures in our society. So in the end, I am strongly opposed to the creation of new federal terrorism charges, even if we think that we would end up using them against white supremacists.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that Patriot Act enabled in terms of counterterrorism authorities was a diminishment of some of the restrictions on sharing of intelligence and domestic operations of intelligence that arose in the wake of COINTELPRO and other things like that. And of course, those are examples precisely of using those sorts of resources and those sorts of justifications for those resources against people who didn't fit with the prevailing social order. And so I think that's a well-founded concern. I guess my question is then, what is the next best alternative? What is a more productive way to pursue these groups that do seem to pose a significant rising and to some degree newly organized threat in a way that does not pose the same risk to the civil rights and the liberties of all groups?
Right. Well, I think the first thing to note is that even without a federal domestic terrorism charge, it's not that federal authorities are not tracking, identifying, or prosecuting individuals from these groups. So we've got 50 other terrorism charges at the federal level already. There's an entire section of the U.S. Criminal Code that refers to federal terrorism criminal charges. So I think the specific question of creating a new charge actually often glosses over the fact that our laws offer significant power to the FBI, to U.S. attorneys at the federal level, and certainly to state and local law enforcement officials as well, to identify and track these organizations. So it's not any lack of power that's the issue here. I think the other thing to consider in this question is that there's almost this view that we can go after white supremacist groups through criminal legal means without addressing the overall politics. And the fact is that when you have people in power at our federal level in particular who openly stoke racial tension and support and sympathize with white supremacist agendas and language, then of course we're going to see an unleashing of violence in multiple forms. So to think of this as purely a criminal legal problem without fundamentally addressing the political nature of the problem is just a non-starter, yet it's often the way in which the policy conversation around domestic terrorism has gone.
So if I could shift gears for a moment, we talked a little bit earlier about the degree to which the civil rights movement was encouraged, supported, and strengthened by the desire to blunt communist propaganda that focused on issues of racial justice within the United States. During the 2016 election, we saw a concerted foreign effort to influence the election. We saw something similar in 2018 and anticipate and are beginning to see the signs of it again in 2020. One of the themes that is persistently picked up on in these sorts of things is an effort on the part of foreign actors to exploit and stoke pre-existing divisions within our society, and one of the major fault lines there is that of race. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how that relates to questions of national security, election security, and how we deal with that going forward.
Yeah. Well, it seems like from, I'm not an expert on this issue, but from what I've read from the intelligence reports that have been made public, it does seem that Russia in particular has targeted Black people on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and other social media platforms, as well as people from across the society, in an effort to, as you note, to amplify grievances and increase division across society. So we know that that is happening. I think the question is, do we approach this as a problem simply of Russian bots, or do we approach this in terms of the underlying grievances? And too often the intelligence conversation ends up being one, well, what do we do to stop Russian disinformation? And yes, that's important. Yes, there's probably much more that could be done, including at the level of the social media platforms themselves. But doing all that will not address the fact that these divisions are there because we have failed historically and today to address the underlying racial grievances. So it's not, Russia doesn't have to make up anything, right? It's not that it has to spread information that has no basis in reality. It simply has to amplify the concerns that exist because of our societal failure to deal with racial injustice. So I think while the focus on Russian disinformation is important, it's an important issue, it shouldn't be seen as an excuse to dismiss Black activism or civil rights, the movement against police violence. Think of it simply in terms of, this is Russian disinformation. The real challenge is to address the underlying racial injustice that we still, as a society, have not surmounted.
One of the issues that raised concerns recently in response to protests in many cities, but especially in Washington, D.C., was the use of federal troops, either federalized National Guard or in some cases active duty troops, to help control civil disturbance. And this was justified. Actually, it was threatened to be justified, since I don't believe the Insurrection Act was ever invoked, but certainly the terms of the Insurrection Act were mentioned as an authority for this, and the notion that the president has very broad emergency powers when it comes to dealing with these things. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those emergency executive powers intersect with questions of race and national security.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I think that we, and by we here, I mean government institutions, including Congress, have failed to constrain national emergency powers in a meaningful way. So we are now at a situation where the executive has invoked numerous national emergencies, and including for things like constructing the border wall. And there's very limited congressional ability to rein that in. So in part, it's this, it's an institutional problem where Congress originally passed the National Emergency Act in the 1970s, thinking it would rein in the scope of national emergency power. But for various reasons, including intervening Supreme Court decisions, Congress's power to rein in national emergency declarations and powers has been quite constrained. So that's part of the issue. It's partly just a failure of our political institutions to take the separation of powers seriously. But more specifically in terms of the use of race, I think here the border wall example is is one on point, because the president essentially defied congressional limits on funding and invoked a national emergency to support the building of a border wall on our southern border. And in doing so, the president in the White House has presented the movement of people from Central America and Mexico as a security threat. And this is consistent with decades of kind of cultural imagery considering the migration of people as a threat to the U.S. nation, to a white U.S. nation. And so Latinx people have often been seen in terms of being a cultural threat to the U.S. And so from there, given that history and those cultural representations, it's not such a jump to invoke the idea of a national emergency as necessary to stop, what was billed as an invasion of people. So that's an example. It's different from, the one you mentioned of the current use of Humvees and military equipment and troops to suppress Black protest. But it's another example of which our concept of what is an emergency is often racially inflected.
So I think the last topic I'd like us to visit is sort of the role of law in the courts in all of this, because one of the things when I was trying to figure out how to have a podcast that addressed questions of race and national security, I was a little bit surprised that the only course I could find being taught on it was in a law school. I would have expected to find that perhaps, and that doesn't mean that there aren't other courses, but certainly the syllabi and the course weren't available online and didn't come up. But on the other hand, as I think about it, it kind of makes sense. I mean, law is to some degree something of a civic religion in the United States. De Tocqueville has a wonderful comment about the tendency of Americans to see things in juristic terms and to take part in judicial proceedings as if they are integral to what's going on in the community. And certainly major inflection points in the role of race in our history can be tracked by major court cases, less positively with Dred Scott and Plessy, but certainly with Brown v. Board of Education and other things like that. But national security seems like an area where the courts are hesitant to tread. And I'm curious about this sort of intersection of law and race and national security and what that suggests about ways ahead. Yeah.
Well, courts have been, I think, in my view, notoriously unwilling to question executive judgments in the area of national security. And, we talked a little bit about some of the cases, Korematsu and the travel ban, which are examples of this. But kind of in recent history, there was a period of a few years between 2004 and 2008, when the court was more willing to question some of the early excesses in the war on terror, including in the detention context. But apart from that brief interlude, the Supreme Court itself has been largely, if not wholly, deferential in the area of national security. And sometimes that's in the form of deciding that a particular challenge to national security policy should not even be heard by a court. So we have, decisions where the court has essentially said, well, no one has standing to challenge a surveillance program because nobody knows for sure that they have been surveilled by that program. So therefore, we will never get to the merits of the legitimacy of the surveillance program because no one is in a position to actually even bring that challenge to the court. So, that's an example of a number of doctrines which essentially disable court challenges to national security policy at the starting gate. You can't even kind of get your foot in the door, as it were. But what I have found fascinating about this idea of national security deference is not just that it has effects on people who are challenging policies, for being, enacted out of racial or religious animus. It's also that the very origins of the doctrine were racially inflected. And here, actually, I think the best source on this is a law review piece written by Sarah Cleveland, a legal scholar in the Texas Law Review, some 20 years ago, where she traces the origins of concepts of foreign affairs deference to lines of Supreme Court decisions involving three sets of non-white populations: Indians, immigrants, and people in territories, U.S. territories. And in all of these cases, the court has embraced this very muscular view of deference to the foreign policy judgments of the executive branch or the political branches. And, even where the policies created had profound effects on communities of color, either within or outside the U.S. So, if you look back at more than 100 years ago at the foundations of some of these doctrines, and then you trace them throughout the 20th century into today, the doctrines both originated in cases involving groups of color and continue to be applied in cases where the national security threats are seen as either domestic or foreign individuals who are non-white. But rarely in discussions of national security deference in these decisions is there any sort of open acknowledgement of that history. So I think that's just a sign of how much further we need to have these conversations on race and national security.
Yeah, and that's especially problematic when you think about the wars that we've been fighting for the last 20 years, the notion that they have been defined in commonality largely only by a religious or racial identity in terms of the adversaries, that makes it very problematic as you start dealing with the questions of perceptions of terrorism, perceptions of threat, and again, perceptions of national security as they intersect with perceptions of race and who we are as a nation. So we've been speaking with Professor Shirin Sinnar of Stanford University Law School. She teaches a course on race, identity, and national security. And I'm really grateful to you for joining us. This is certainly not the last of these conversations that we need to have, but I think it's been incredibly helpful and thoughtful in helping to scope out and think about where the corners of this concept, when we say we need to expand the definition of national security and think about it more holistically, I feel like this has been helpful in doing so, and I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much. And if I can make one final comment, I recently saw a quotation to James Baldwin, which I thought was very powerful. And he wasn't speaking specifically about national security policy. He was talking more about policing and the justice system within the U.S. But his point was, and I'll just read these words, well, if one really wishes to know how justice is administered in a country, one does not question the policemen, the lawyers, the judges, or the protected members of the middle class. One goes to the unprotected and listens to their testimony. And I think that's a point that could also be made in our conversations about national security policy, that it's not enough to consult the experts who have worked within national security institutions. We also need to consult those who have suffered from national security actions, either at home or abroad. And we won't fully understand the experience of national security until we do that.
That is a powerful thought, and I think an excellent one on which to conclude. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.